Give me my freedom for as long as I be. All I ask of living is to put no chains on me. Well, all I ask of living is to put no chains on me. And all I ask of dying is to go naturally. I wanna go naturally. 'Cause when I die, and when I'm gone, dead and gone, there'll be one child born in this world to carry on, carry on.
Atlas shouts, a modern patriot calls for action. I wrote the synopsis for this book 3 years ago, and I want to start by reading it today. Their behavior can easily be compared to the Jim Crow South, only this time it's constitutional conservatives who are being abused. I was told that Jim Crow term was too sensational and exaggerated, but remember, that was 3 years ago. I'd spent about 10 years studying social media and public dialogue, and I could see in the past of 10 years, I could see the trajectory where it was headed, and I could predict in 2 to 3 years in the future, the term Jim Crow would be a lot more appropriate. And sure enough, in February of 2016, I went to the Drudge News website, and the Drudge headline read, "Christian Conservatives Under Siege." So whether you're Christian or conservative or just a fan of the Constitution, this is a pretty disturbing headline. Well, hello everyone, I'm John Lofgren. I'm the author of Atlas Shouts. It's the #2 money book on Amazon right now, out of 7,000 books. This book's going to tell you how to fix America and fix it the American way. So let's have a little bio first so you know who's talking to you. I'm John Lofgren. Again, I come from a small town in Florida. My dad fought in the war for George S. Patton, came home and became a high school principal in my hometown. And I played some football, and I got to work on a farm for a while for a guy named Mr. McDowell. And Mr. McDowell taught me a great lesson one day. I want to share it with you. I was working out in the field, in the cattle field, and Mr. McDowell always told me, "John, don't leave the cattle gate open even for a minute." Well, sure enough, one day after a year or two of working for him, I left the cattle gate open just a little too long, and all the cows ran out. So I was upset. I ran back to the cabin, called Mr. McDowell up. He said, "John, you got to remember one thing. You're smarter than a cow." So that gave me a good belly laugh, and I released a lot of the tension because I was pretty worried he was going to cuss me out. And he told me a little trick to bring all the cows back in. Sure enough, I went out there, and a half hour later, all the cows were back in the pen, and life returned to normal. But I learned a great lesson that day. I was smarter than the cow. So, somewhere between cow and Albert Einstein on the pecking order, I was somewhere in there, and my future could perhaps be unlimited. So I went to engineering school, got my engineering degree at University of Florida, and I proceeded to a circuit design job at Lockheed Martin. Got to work for a lot of smart people there and contributed to their products quite a bit. I got 4 patents and was co-inventor of the year one year. But the best thing I learned at Lockheed Martin was I learned best practices. They spent a lot of time capturing what were the best ways to do things and the worst ways to do things, and they put it all in a nice manual. You're going to read some of that best practices methodology in this book as you read it. Atlas Shouts is a best practices manual. Next place I work is Synopsys. Synopsys is a company that makes very complicated software to design integrated circuits. I got to work out of Orlando, but I reported to Silicon Valley out in California. And what I worked on at Synopsys was sales. I worked in sales. So I learned very powerful persuasive and influence techniques for our customers, because we sold very expensive products and they spared no money training us for the most extravagant and powerful selling techniques known in the industry. And the best thing I learned at Synopsys was those sales techniques. I heard a phrase that captured it the best from one of the sales guys once. His phrase went like this. It said, when they're talking, you're selling. So the point is, keep the customer talking. And you're going to see that play a role in how to form the information in this book too. I'm going to use those techniques to try to sell good methodology on social media. I had a couple more jobs designing night vision scopes for the Army and cryptography. But my real passion in life is playing guitar and singing, as you heard already. I like to sing a lot of Motown, and I play with a great sax player, Warren Stevens, and I just have a blast doing that. My favorite singers are Al Green and Ray Charles, and my favorite writers are Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams. You're going to read a lot of Thomas Sowell and Walter Williams' influence in this book. So that's me, John Lofgren. I'm an engineer, I'm an author, and I'm a singer and guitar player. So that's enough about me. Let's talk a little bit about how this book came about. Two things were driving me when I wrote this book. I wanted to make the world a better place, and I wanted to bring some comfort to someone I knew that was in a great deal of pain. Now, it may surprise you that making money is not on that list, but I never dreamed I would make any money off this book, and sure enough, I haven't made any money yet. Well, doing good requires some confrontation. Yeah, remember Erin Brokavitch, the movie character played by Julia Roberts, and she discovered some chemical pollution in her hometown. And the people at first weren't happy that she was exposing it because it was threatening their livelihoods. Well, she exposed chemical pollution, and Atlas Shouts exposed economic pollution. So that's what I'm here to tell you about a little bit today. Not just about the pollution, but how we can fix it too. When you're writing a book like this that has a bit of controversy, it's always a good thing to have some good quotes in your head to keep you going, and some good influences. And I did. I'm going to tell you about those. Let's talk about a few of these quotes because they're kind of funny in some ways. Winston Churchill said, "If you have no enemies, you've never stood up for anything." So I knew when a few people got upset about what I was writing, I knew should have pretty much expect that. If I was doing anything important, then I'm going to get some people upset with me. When you're seeing flak, you're approaching the target. A man is not a man until he's made the world a better place. Well, as I tell you, this book's going to tell you how to make the world a better place. Atlas Shouts. So let's talk a little bit about all the truth that's in this book and the influences. Let's see if we can't shine a flashlight through the dark and see where we need to go. I'm going to split the discussion into 3 parts. There's going to be a part about what inspired me, and then about the creation of the book itself, what's between the covers, and then what is the call for action? What do we need to do in the future to get back on track? Let's start by reviewing some fascinating characters I ran into and how this all came together. The year is 2012, so we're 4 years ago, and I've been studying economics and talking on social media trying to influence people for 10 years, and I wasn't having any luck at all. So I was frustrated and I was concerned because you see what I found out about economics was there was a lot of conflict in it. There was a liberal and a conservative side. So the first thing I found out was economics is more of a political science than it is a epistemological science. And then I also found the people on one side of the economic camp were making conflicting statements, and that began to bother me because if some story has a lot of conflicts in it, it's usually not true. So imagine this bubbling cauldron in front of me, this bubbling cauldron with all these troubling facts bubbling and boiling, and I'm stirring it up trying to figure out what to do. What do I make out of this ugly soup? I don't know what to do. There's black smoke coming out of the kettle, and my wife's getting a little bothered that I'm a little stressed about this. Friends see it. And along come 3 characters that kind of give me an idea of what direction I need to go in. Let's talk about those 3 characters. They're Nehemiah, Ben Franklin, and Brendan Salazar. So Nehemiah, in the year 445 BC, he's the cupbearer for the king. And Jerusalem is exposed. There's no wall around Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is exposed to enemies. Nehemiah knows they need to build a wall around it, make it a fortress. And nobody wants to help him, though. He can't convince anybody it's the right thing to do. So he grabs his tool and marches out one day outside the city and begins building the wall himself. And other people see his fervor and his commitment, They join in, and eventually a group of town people out helping him, they finish the wall in 52 days. So Nehemiah impresses me because he's a guy that, when sees something needs to be done, sometimes you just get out and do it yourself, and other people will fall in when they see it makes sense. Ben Franklin's my next influence. I read the book. It's a great book. Ben Franklin, An American Life by Isaacson. And Ben's story catches me because we have three common things in parallel. The three common things are he's kind of a geek, physics guy, and I was an engineer. The next thing is he likes to write. He likes to write short, pithy quotes and essays, and so had I at the time. And he also likes to have town meetings called the Junto Club. The Junto Club, they discuss weighty matters of the day, and sure enough, I had done that myself at Lockheed Martin. We used to meet on Friday afternoons to talk policy and politics at the local Don Pablo's. Ben Franklin created an interesting meeting rule that's going to have an impact on this book. I'm going to tell you about it right now because we're going to visit it later. His meeting rule is this: all expressions of positive opinion or direct contradiction were after some time made contraband and prohibited under small pecuniary or tiny penalties. So Ben Franklin documents a meeting rule that's important for order and progress in the meetings. Now I'm going to try that out on social media and tell you what happened. The last guy to influence me is Brendan Salazar. Now Brendan, the first time I hear of this guy, I hear about he's been killed in Afghanistan. It's 2012. And I'd been a war history buff all my life and worked in the defense industry, and I'd never been to a funeral for a soldier, so I decided to go. And it kind of changed my life. I saw the bravery of his mother speaking, and I saw the pain the family was going through. So I decided that day, and in the next few days, that I wasn't being a very good steward of watching what our government was doing. I had a lot of knowledge up here in my head, a lot of things swirling around. I had the bubbling cauldron, but I wasn't doing anything with it. And I saw that Brendan was a man of action too, and I decided, I need to get up and do something too here, because he's out. While I was at the defense factory making bullets, he was out taking bullets. He was the tip of the spear, and I was sitting in a comfortable air-conditioned office. So I decided, Brendan really motivated me that I got to get something going here, like Nehemiah did, or Ben Franklin did, to help make things better for everybody. And that's when my wife suggested, why don't you write a book? So I did. So that's pretty much all I'm going to say about what inspired me to write the book. Let's talk about the next thing. Remember I told you we talked about the inspiration? Let's talk about what's between the covers.
Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah River. I was old there, older than the trees, younger than the mountains, blowing like a breeze. Country roads take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, mountain mama, take me home. Country roads.
Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about the second part of this presentation, which is what's inside the covers. I picked three topics: the Colombo deduction, press, subjugation, and Campbell's Law. I only picked three topics because if I try to tell you a general overview, you're not going to get an idea of the depth of this book. This book goes very deep in specific areas to help educate you quickly on what's going on underneath the covers. So let's talk first about the Colombo deduction. I'm sure that seems a little obscure to some of you and very familiar to others. Columbo was a detective on a TV series in the 70s. He was very unique because he always wore a crumpled trench coat. He smoked an old stubby cigar, and his hair was always disheveled. And whenever he arrived on a crime scene, he always seemed to annoy people a little bit with questions because he asked very good expository questions. And what happened is when he asked people who were potential suspects certain questions, you would notice their behavior would change. So I thought about Columbo in 2012 because I had been having debates on social media for 2 years. And during those 2 years, I had an estimated probably 2,000 to 3,000 debates because I debated a lot in the evening. And what I did is I created a safe space for policy discussion on my wall. And in that safe space, I made sure everybody was comfortable, liberal and conservative. And I had a lot of conversations going. I had compliments from the liberals because they complimented me that your wall, John, is a wall I can come to and argue without being insulted. But unfortunately, over that 2-year period, I was unable to change the mind of any liberal on economic policy. They had a knack for always avoiding the evidence that conservative economic principles work and avoiding the evidence that socialist economic principles fail every time. So they just didn't want to talk about that. So I estimate I lost at every argument I had on social media about conservative economics. And it started occurring to me, a lot of people told me, well, that's because they're ignorant and they don't understand. But I had a different theory. My theory was this: if they knew those topics to avoid, the success for capitalism and all the failures of socialism, if they knew to avoid those, then they couldn't be ignorant or slow-witted. They had to be smart and intelligent. And sure enough, I knew some very smart people that would argue for liberal economic principles. I started asking them Columbo questions to see if they really knew the truth. And guess what? Their demeanor changed and their attitude changed. So I concluded that all the liberals knew the truth about what was going on, and they just weren't going to argue with you about any truth for conservative economic principles on social media. That's the Columbo deduction. To summarize, let me make a closing statement on this. The Columbo deduction is this: we can systematically tell what people know and what they don't know by watching for 11 tactics of deception when you ask them questions. All right, that's all I'm going to talk about with the Columbo deduction. Let's talk next about what's going on with the press. As I did my research, I discovered one article after another of whistleblowers inside the press telling us that they're being coerced, intimidated, and manipulated by the government, in particular the Obama administration. Even Jill Abramson says they had 8 lawsuits brought against the New York Times while she was chief editor. And she said there were no lawsuits from W. Bush. And that's not to say I was a fan of George W. Bush. But he didn't lawyer up every time the paper printed something he didn't like. Other notable contributors to this list of 25 hot links is Cheryl Atkinson of CBS. Her computers got broken into, and CBS didn't even investigate why or who did it. They refused to talk to her about it. And finally, Pulitzer Prize winner Seymour Hersh says Obama lies systematically, and 90% of the editors should be fired. So that's all I want to say about that. The press is a mess. Every time you read a story from the United States media, just keep in mind, they're not lying to you. They're just telling you about a bunch of news that's not really important. And all the important news has been buried or pushed onto a back page. You got to look a little bit and look for the inconsistencies. And that's what I did, and that's what fills up this book. Finally, the last thing is Campbell's Law. Campbell's Law was written by a Princeton economist in the early 70s, when Princeton was still a solid school. Let's talk about Campbell's Law. Let me read it to you. The more any measurement is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor. So what they're saying, to give you an analogy, is if you had a freeway with 10,000 cars on it, and you could change everyone's speedometer to read 10 miles an hour faster, then what would happen is that whole group of 10,000 cars would drift toward 10 miles an hour slower because they would all think they're going too fast. Somebody changed their instrumentation. So as an engineer, you learn that instrumentation is critical. If you're not getting accurate readings about what's going on, you're going to make really poor decisions. It troubles me to say this, but I found very deep manipulation of three big economic indicators: the gross domestic product, GDP, inflation, and unemployment. GDP is manipulated because they count deficit spending in the GDP. It's pretty simple that if the government sees halfway through a quarter that the GDP is going to fall, they can simply start spending more, and it will drive the GDP up pretty quick. And sure enough, if you look at deficit spending, it's been going up rapidly the last 30 or 40 years. It's my conclusion that they're increasing this deficit spending to keep the GDP inflated. The next thing is inflation. Inflation is based on a basket of goods. There's thousands of goods in here, and they put a weight on the price increase of each item in the basket. What they're doing with inflation is they're changing the weights on the basket of goods. They did it once in the Reagan era, and they did it in the Clinton era. A researcher I'm aware of named John Williams on Shadow Stats did an article where he went back and got the Reagan era weighting and he got the Clinton era weighting, and he compared it to today. Today they're talking 1 or 2% inflation. By the Clinton era measurements, inflation should be 10%. And guess what? By the Reagan era measure, it should be 20%. So they're literally dialing the weighting on all these items to hide the inflation more and more, so they can tell you a nice rosy inflation number. And the last thing I want to tell you about is unemployment. This one's pretty obvious. Unemployment number is created with a numerator on a fraction, and a denominator. And they're changing the amount of people that are counted in the numerator. They're excluding people that are, quote unquote, not looking for work. So by playing games with that, they're making unemployment look far lower than it actually is. Well, that's all I want to tell you about Campbell's Law. They're manipulating the huge economic measures, and it's misleading the public. All right, that takes us to the fun part of the book, the last section. In the last section, I want to talk about the changes that are required to do. What do we need to do to fix things? Because Atlas Shouts is not just a book about what's wrong, but it's how to fix it and make it right, how you can contribute. So I see three areas we need to fix the country right now. We need to work on constitutional change, on social change, and asking for a bit of spiritual help. Can't hurt. So let's talk about all those three things. Why do we need constitutional change? Well, if you remember early in the presentation, I told you I was at a company where they used best practices manuals, and it was really a powerful influence and made the quality of everything we did go up. So I started studying government best practices in order to find remedies for what's going on right now. The first thing I found is that the longest lasting governments in the world were all republics. A republic is marked by appointed senators in the legislative body. So in other words, each area of the country appoints a representative to go, and they all create legislation. The three countries that were republics are Rome, Sparta, and Carthage, and they all lasted the longest of any country in the world up to the time of the American Revolution. So what did our founders do? They, of course, adopted that. That was what the Senate used to do until 1913. In 1913, the Woodrow Wilson Progressive passed Amendment 17, and Amendment 17 ended appointed senators. We went to elected senators. Now, the bad thing is, once you elect senators, and since the House of Representatives is all elected, then you've got two elected legislative bodies, which makes us a bicameral democracy, not a republic. Now, some not so good news. Democracy is the worst form of government on earth. Going all the way back to Polybius in 300 BC, we can find references to how poorly democracy works and how adored it is by communist leaders like Vladimir Lenin. So once we made that change in 1913, the course of the United States was set. We were going to fail in a few generations. The other thing I found that's a worse practice is the idea of using government stimulus, of borrowing money to restart or kickstart an economy. Has never worked. It's never worked anywhere on earth. It's always been a failure. And using Columbo questions, I found that all the people that promote it know this. They know it fails all the time. So what do we got to do? We're not going to fix the country through democratic forms, because democracy always fails. I started looking for answers there too, and I found Mark Levin's book had the best answer, an Article 5 convention. And Mark Levin's book makes the case for an Article 5 convention through more legal foundations. Mine makes it in economic foundations, in dollar and cents terms. Why do we need to do this? I began to look for groups that were pushing a convention of states, who were proposing the right amendments to fix the country. Because I wrote my book, I had some amendments in mind. And the closest ones I came, in fact they were pretty spot on, was a conventionstates.com. That's Michael Ferris and Mark Meckler, two very good men leading it. And I got involved with the volunteers in the state of Florida that are working on it. Florida has already passed a Convention of States amendment, so they are ready to participate. And what I found were all the volunteers were just tremendously good people who knew what needed to be done to fix the country. We even had a simulation in Tampa where 50 people got together and we spent 3 days in a hotel room, hammering out some amendments like any good representatives at a real convention would do. And one of the scare factors we hear about a convention of states is that we'll diverge and everybody will want to rewrite the whole Constitution. Well, our convention converged very rapidly on 6 amendments and it went extremely well. We've also had, as a group, as a national group, they've held one other simulation somewhere else, and it also converged. So things are going well. This is not a divergent process, it's a convergent process. And you might wonder what my amendments I propose are. Let's talk about my amendments. The amendments I propose is to abolish Amendment 17 so we become a republic again. And I also recommend we have a majority vote of 50 governors can vote to remove any Supreme Court justice for any reason. We have to put some checks on the Supreme Court's power. They simply are serving only the whim of the president right now, and that's very unhealthy. The other thing the judiciary is doing more and more is using rulings based on outside influences, rulings from Sharia, rulings from international law. These are just unacceptable. The only thing the Supreme Court can make a ruling on is the Constitution. And we don't even want them using case precedents. In other words, looking back to a bad decision that was made 50 years ago and sticking with it because the Supreme Court made the decision. That needs to be abolished. And the way we do that is pass an amendment to mandate constructionist review process. Constructionism is where you make all judicial decisions based on collateral writing of the legislators that crafted the law and the law itself and what's in the Constitution. That's the only 3 things they should be looking at. And when they're done, they issue an up or down ruling. There is no ruling that has well, part of this is okay and part of this is not. They issue an up or down ruling on any law, and they don't issue any remedy. The remedy is to kick the law out, throw the law back to the legislator, and tell the legislatures to come up with a law that meets constitutional muster. All right, that's all my amendments. Let's talk about the next area of change, social change. Now, as I told you, in this big experiment I had online, I created this safe space for 2 years where everybody argued graciously. And I told you that I lost every argument with liberals for liberal economic policy. And what I realized is they were working away, they were always squirreling away from solutions that worked in capitalist favor and solutions that didn't work in socialism's favor. So I decided to try out those Columbo rules, and sure enough I found out they all knew that what we're saying was incorrect. And the second experiment I did was to try Ben Franklin's rule out. Remember, Ben Franklin abolished opinion and he made contradiction contraband. So I tried that rule out on my wall. I made opinion and contradiction contraband. And within 3 weeks, the quality of the discussion on my wall skyrocketed. more people joined up over the next 2 to 3 months, and it became a much more vibrant and positive discussion. You can influence conservatives to change their mind. You can do that. But you know what I found? The liberals all stopped arguing. They all disappeared. They didn't want to debate in a debate where you used only facts and only solid logic. That was quite surprising to me. But all of them left, and many left in very bitter tones and angry. You know, Don Henley sang a song once, "Sometimes the best light is cast by a burning bridge." Well, I lost some really good friends just because I made it a rule on my wall to argue with facts and logic only. You know, a closing statement on this: to lie or attempt to deceive someone in debate is totally unacceptable, because if one debater is honest and the other is not, the dishonest party will imagine their behavior is acceptable in all future dialogue. So we have to start confronting people who are not telling the truth. And we have to start demanding people stop using opinion to influence public policy. Opinion is usually a combination of ego and a false claim, masquerading as opinion. All right. That's pretty much all I want to talk about in the book. You know, I mentioned 3 topics: constitutional change, social change, and the last change is we should ask for a little help from above. So I want to wrap up today by offering a prayer, and we'll close, and then the floor will open for questions. God, please come into this room today and be with us. Let us feel your power, your might, and your glory, and your wisdom. We pray that as we start on this journey to fix our country, that you keep us of sound heart and mind, that we are led by a passion for justice and equality, not by hate or contempt. We ask these things in your Son's name we pray. Jesus, amen.